The Spider-Man sequel is likely to be revealed at Sony's next PS5 event. The big question is, should it also get a cross-gen release on PS4? The new generation consoles launched last November, and of course everybody's looking forward to next-gen only games that can reflect the power and the capabilities of these new consoles. And whilst there have been some next-gen only exclusives, including Demon's Souls and Godfall, what people really want are games that are impossible to run on older hardware. In this video, I will explore the business and technical reasons for making a game cross-generational, and whether because of this Spider-Man 2 should be PS5 only or also get a PS4 release. So make sure you stay to the end as I give you my shocking verdict. So of course the reason you buy a new games console is because you want to experience new, better, more powerful games. But recently there has been a controversy with regards to games that were announced for the PS5, in that they are also going to be available for the PS4. And it raises the question on whether these games are not as good as they could have been. The head of PlayStation Studios, Hermen Hulst, recently revealed that the God of War sequel and Gran Turismo 7 would not be PS5 exclusive, but would also be released on PS4. And there was some surprise about this and some anger, because in the case of GT7, that had actually had an advertisement where it specifically said it was a PS5 exclusive. So essentially there's three real reasons for this happening. The first is financial, and this is down to ultimately the pandemic. This has led to greater use of computers and computer equipment. It's also had a knock-on effect of meaning there is a component shortage. So Sony can't make enough PS5s to get into the stores to be able to have a big enough install base to be able to sell the amount of games it had forecast for each of these big releases. So it needs to be able to still sell a high number of games. And the way it can do this is by offering the games now to PS4 owners, many who would be left behind who would not otherwise be able to join in these new experiences. One of the other main reasons that Sony is doing this is to support user-based migration to the PS5. Not every PS4 owner is an early adopter. Some choose not to be, some can't afford to be. But what Sony needs to do is be able to support them with games. And part of this process is making sure that they can have games which will also be playable on PS5 once they upgrade. And this is really important because one of the big mistakes that Microsoft made when moving between the Xbox 360 generation to the Xbox One was that it lost a huge chunk of its install base as they migrated to the PS4, and this is a mistake that Sony is trying to learn from. It's got this massive, incredible 110 million user base install base, and it needs to try and help them move to the PS5, and the best way to do this is to sell them games, offer them games that work on the PS4, and then Sony can say if you buy these games they will also be available on your new PS5 once you get one, and these games will be improved and better and more enjoyable. So it's a great method not to lose the people that Sony already has as customers. The most important factor with some of these games is the production start time. The truth is, many of these cross-gen games were started years before PS5 hardware was available, let alone when it was finalized. Last year, the Sucker Punch team, whilst they were completing Ghost of Tsushima, the director said they never even had the PS5 hardware. Brian Fleming, who is the co-founder and producer of Ghost, in July 2020 he said, if you're going to be one of the final big titles on a console, you're kind of necessarily one of the trailing groups getting onto the next hardware, and that's kind of where we are. So the meaning of this is that Sony would not have prioritized them to get them PS5 hardware because they weren't making a game for PS5 hardware, it was for the PS4. So if in 2020 it wasn't getting PS5 hardware, the games that were started earlier, they certainly weren't going to be built for PS5s. So Horizon Zero Dawn, that was released in February 2017, the new game would have likely started shortly after. God of War was released April 2018, and Spider-Man in September 2018. So certainly they would have got straight to work on the sequels, and at that time they wouldn't have been getting PS5 hardware. Of course, many games are made targeting future hardware, but as the first Spider-Man game was released just months after God of War, we can assume its sequel would have the same development time and be targeting the same level of hardware. And what we can understand from these dates is that the next gen versions would not have been held back because they were likely always going to be intended to be a current gen version. And Colin Moriarty, the veteran PlayStation reporter and podcaster, he said the sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West, it was always intended intended to be a PS4 game, and then it was scaled up to work on PS5. And this is from apparently his insider sources. So we can take this as an example of what's likely been happening behind the scenes. These games that have been in the works for PS4, Sony has understand the need to be able to then easily translate them, upgrade them, and produce a PS5 version as well. In fact, the Horizon Forbidden West game director, he specifically said, "I don't think the cross-generation development was limited in any way. When we started with the concept of this game, we had so many great ideas that ended up being included, to the point that we really didn't think about hardware limitations or anything. We just wanted to design a really nice, unique experience for the player." So these games were started before the PS5 hardware was completed, before the specification was probably locked down even. So these games perhaps didn't have their ambition scaled back, as they were always intended for last gen. But supporting last gen isn't always going to be productive. There are also some bad sides. Last generation hardware was released in 2013. That's now 8 years ago. Very dated hardware. If we have a look at a game like Cyberpunk 2077, yes, you could say the game needed time for more optimization, but a big part of the issues is that the base PS4 and Xbox One are working overtime to run a game that was more than likely designed for a specification much higher than what they are. And that's why the game launched running very badly on these systems. One of the initial issues was that you could have your character looking in one direction down the street, you turn the opposite direction and then you turn back, and everything that was there, whether it be a car, pedestrians, whoever, is now gone. And this seems to be an issue where the game was wiping what was in the memory because it simply didn't have enough to run the game properly and be able to highlight or illustrate a realistic living and breathing world. Remedy Entertainment has said that supporting older hardware can limit the scope of games on new generation consoles.
The challenge is that whenever you're in this cross-generational point, to be blunt, it sucks. You gotta support the previous gen, make sure that syncs, and then whatever you kind of bring to next gen is still honestly pretty limited by the choices you made years ago for the previous generation.
What exactly makes a game next gen? Well, there's the obvious part of the answer to this and the not so obvious part of the answer, but that ultimately has the greatest repercussions to do with game design. So the obvious is to do with the graphical enhancements, 4K graphics, a higher frame rate, 60 FPS, maybe even 120 FPS, ray tracing effects that make the worlds look believable, and of course the direct effect of the SSD, which is fast loading. So both PS5 and Xbox Series X have these improvements. PS5 games have additional features to PS4 games, haptics and adaptive triggers in the DualSense, 3D audio, but all of these, they're just enhancements. They improve the experience, they make it better, but ultimately they are just the cream and cherries on the top of a cake. But underneath it all, it's the same game as the last gen version. The game plays the same, there's no difference in gameplay, there's no difference in in-game features. So what is next-gen gameplay exactly? What I'm talking about, and what most people are talking about, is gameplay that is designed from the outset to be next-gen only. The first sort of clue as to what this is was last year when Mark Cerny, during the Road to PS5 speech, he sort of explained some of the design limitations that developers have to abide by to make their games. For example, designing levels that are made to be in smaller chunks because the hard drive can't normally load up a full level all at once. So levels are purposely restricted and are designed to perform to the limitations of the hard drive. Now we actually have some good examples of what next-gen only gameplay means for the overall experience. So of course there's Ratchet & Clank A Rift Apart. Now I haven't played it yet, but from the trailers and from the gameplay, a big part of the gameplay is that you are able to travel from one realm to another in an instant, and this means immediate or near immediate loading of the new level. And this is something that simply can't be done on a traditional hard drive with moving parts. Also at E3, Ubisoft announced their new game, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, an action-adventure game based on the movie franchise. Now with this game, Ubisoft have come out and said it's going to be next-gen only, and in an interview, the technical director, he's actually said why it has to be next-gen only, and what it means in terms of improvements to gameplay. He said, "New consoles allowed us to have much better object detail up close to you, but also when you're flying high up in the air, to have a lovely vista and far distance rendering, where you can even use the ray tracing to do shadows super far away. You're flying at enormous high speeds on a Banshee over this very detailed landscape. It doesn't matter how much we can render unless we can stream it in as fast as when you're moving very fast from one place to another. So just this shift to these new hard drives, it can't be underestimated, and it really has a lot of implications. So what he's saying there is it's not just about making the game world look detailed, but making it look detailed at a far distance. And because a big part of the gameplay is high speed flying, you need to be able to draw the landscape at speed so that the game world always remains detailed and you always have that fluid motion, which is not going to be possible for using a console that uses a hard drive. He also goes on to explain that many games are spaced out in the areas that the player can travel to as a necessary measure to be able to load the game or to load part of the game in. They're going to be able, with this game Avatar, the team are going to be able to make the areas less spaced out, more condensed, and feel more alive. And the enemy and creature AI will be more intelligent. Perhaps it tackles you in a better way in combat, and perhaps it just comes across as more complex. How the game will turn out, we'll have to wait and see, but what he's actually explaining to us is that the game is able to do stuff that's simply not possible otherwise. It sounds fantastic. Now Deathloop, which is an exclusive to PS5 for a year, made by Arcane Studios, they have also gone on to talk about the benefit of being a next-gen exclusive game. The director said, "I don't think that we could have been able to preserve the level of ambition of this game were it not for the move to next-gen. It's always heartbreaking when you get to the end of a project and you have to optimize things, and now you have to cut your map in half and you have to justify why it's in two parts." So from that statement, we can deduce that he is saying normally with last-gen games, they are always having to make workarounds and compromises to make the game world that they had been envisioning work on the system, on the platform that they have. And that doesn't need to be done as much on the new generation hardware, on the PS5. This may mean that you can travel across the whole map without there needing to be any loading, without that breaking of immersion. Right, so how does this all pertain to what a Spider-Man sequel looks like or plays like? Right, at this point, there has been no official confirmation. So what we have had is one Twitter tease about a project that's been worked on by Insomniac. But more importantly than that, back in 2018, when the original game was released, the game director, Brian Intihar, he was asked about the non-appearance of the Black Spider-Man costume in the game. And this is what he said.
I think that something like that suit deserves its day in the spotlight. And I think just making it a unlockable suit wouldn't be doing it justice. It's one of the best stories for Spider-Man, and I think that it's a complex story. I think that that story needs to be told, and it needs to be told in the way that Insomniac would tell it.
And of course, the story of the suit, the symbiote, and what happens with it is ultimately Venom's story, my namesake. So it looks like that's what's going to be dominating the whole storyline. But in terms of gameplay, of course it's going to have support for the PS5's DualSense. Of course there will be support for the 3D audio, bells and whistles. But what could the actual game look like, play like? And this is the big question. So in 2019, a Wall Street journalist leaked Sony footage of how Spider-Man could run on next-gen hardware. And this leak showed an internal video of Sony's which compared Spider-Man running on PS4 Pro to Spider-Man running on its next-generation hardware with an SSD. So you see on the PS4 Pro, he swings through buildings and he's swinging at normal speed, it looks fine. And then with the SSD, what you can see, the SSD running on the PS5, you see Spider-Man swinging so much faster at a phenomenal speed, in fact. So anybody who's played the original Spider-Man and Miles Morales, I don't think there's going to be any complaints from anyone saying that the swinging was too slow, because it ran fine. You've got a great sensation, it's one of the best parts of the game, this mechanic to allow you to swing through the buildings, because it feels fantastic. So on one hand, you may ask yourself, well, why do you need to swing that fast? It just seems too fast. But perhaps that will be a part of the game. Maybe there will be super fast swinging, maybe you'll be chasing some element that is traveling at speed, a fast aeroplane, or a person on a jet, or the Green Goblin. So the inclusion of the SSD on the PS5 can mean that there will be more dynamic, faster moving traversal, faster moving combat. So we all know what the Spider-Man gameplay is like. At its core, it's two elements, swinging through a city and fighting enemies. And I'll be honest with you, this doesn't require advanced hardware. Besides there being a 3D Spider-Man on PS5, on PS4, on PS3, on PS2, there was even a 3D Spider-Man game on PS1. In theory, you could make a Miles Morales remake and it would run on PS1. It would have the same gameplay. Yes, Miles Morales running on PS5 would be so much prettier when compared to a demake, you know, faster movement, open spaces, all these set pieces like on the bridge, but the gameplay mechanic at its core is the same. So on one half there is the assumption that the gameplay will remain the same, will just be a palette swap, perhaps a new map, perhaps a new enemy and a new story, but for a big game like this, Spider-Man, the 2018 version, has been Sony's biggest selling first party game on PS4. So for a game that has got this massive potential to outsell the original, Insomniac are going to want to switch it up a bit and raise the bar. So yes, maybe it will be in a new city, but what have Insomniac learned from Ratchet & Clank? Perhaps there's an alien element to it with the symbiote story. Maybe Spider-Man will be taken out of an urban city landscape, so you can travel to an alien homeworld. Or maybe you'll get to play as Peter Parker being led by the symbiote, or maybe you will even get to play as Venom, so you can see Eddie Brock's story as well. But I would imagine that the core gameplay experience is still going to be swinging through a city. And whilst I'm as eager to play the next gen only games as anybody else, with all the Sony games that are getting a cross-gen release such as Horizon Forbidden West, the God of War sequel, Gran Turismo 7 and even Spider-Man, the gameplay in the Spider-Man sequel is going to be the least likely to be compromised. So it does make perfect sense for it to get a cross-gen release on PS4. Especially if this is released at the tail end of 2022 or 2023. And I get it, I do get it, that some people are understandably going to be disappointed by this, but judging by the gameplay and judging by the time it's likely to be released, I do think, and I hope you can see it too, that it makes sense that it is a cross-gen game. Although I do hope that this will be the very last of the big Sony exclusives to do this. So, do you think the next Spider-Man game should be released on PS4? Let me know, leave a comment and I'll promise to read it, and make sure to like and subscribe. Cheers.